Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and esteemed panelists, I am very honored to be back here at the University of Pretoria, where I partly got my education from. So it's a deep honor to chair this session. I would like us to delve into a very crucial and timely topic for this part of the conference, focusing on Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a form of colonialism. And that's also with a question mark there at the end. Can we talk about Russian colonialism? Now, in light of recent developments and the complex narratives surrounding Russia's actions, this panel will shed light on the multi-phased dimensions of Russia's war in Ukraine and its implications both regionally and globally. Russia's diplomatic efforts and self-portrayal as an anti-colonial force, particularly in Africa, along with its deployment of memory diplomacy, historical narratives, and self-image, wield significant influence in molding perceptions of the ongoing war. At the same time, in our evolving global landscape, many African countries have focused on decolonization of history, and several of the panelists also during the previous panel referred to this process. And this is frequently accompanied by the removal of colonial era statues and renaming of street names. I've had the privilege also of spending quite a bit of time in Central and Eastern Europe, including living in Latvia, and I think one of the things that I noticed there is that Central and Eastern European countries are going through many of the same processes that we are experiencing here in South Africa and in other parts of the continent. From Tallinn to Kiev, people have come together to remove statues associated with what they identify as Russian colonialism in a not too dissimilar fashion as the Rhodes Must Fall movement that we experience here in South Africa. And here, as I mentioned, where I got the bulk of my education, we were not really taught to think about Russia as a colonial power. It makes us very uncomfortable to think in that direction. Yet, I think it's also crucial to recognize that a large part of our understanding of European history, both not just in Africa, but also in the West, tends to be dominated, as Professor Ezike mentioned earlier, by a very much a Russo-centric perspective and understanding. So this conference is therefore vital, I think, in that it brings together various Africans, Lithuanians, Czechs, Ukrainians, to include their perspectives also on how they view the history of the 20th century and how that relates to our current understanding of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, during this particular panel, we'll explore how Russia's actions in Ukraine intersects with its historical and contemporary narratives of anti-imperialism, complexities of its self-image as a non-imperialist power, and the responses from various quarters, including African nations and Ukraine itself. And we are very fortunate today to be joined by a very distinguished group of panelists. I'd like to welcome first, I should, according to protocol, first welcome Lithuania's ambassador, Her Excellency Rasa Jankauskaitė. She was just accredited yesterday, so this is, I believe, her very first. Yes, please give her a warm welcome. I think this is her very first official public event as ambassador. So very welcome to you, Ambassador. Then I would also like to welcome Olga Tokariuk, who I've collaborated many times before because we're both fellows at the Center for European Policy Analysis, in addition to many other affiliations that she has. But she's an independent journalist, and she's also a former fellow. She was also a former fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. Then I would like to give a very warm welcome also to Professor David Monyae. He's the co-director of the University of Johannesburg's Confucius Institute and the Center for Africa-China Studies. Very, very welcome to you also, Professor. And then last but not least, I'd also like to welcome Dr. Bohumil, Doboš. He's from the Institute of Political Studies at Charles University from the Czech Republic, so welcome to you also. All right, so I think I'm going to kick off this discussion by first asking Olga, since she's Ukrainian, to just maybe give just a few sentences on giving us some first-hand insight into the impact of Russia's actions in Ukraine and how that impacts on Ukraine's quest to preserve its independence. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you, everyone, for this invitation. It's an honor for me to be speaking here at the University of Pretoria, and I would also like to compliment the speakers and those who asked questions and the moderator of the previous panel. It was excellent. I learned so much. And my goal here is not just to talk to you, but also learn from you. So please feel free to come and speak to me privately after the end of the session. I will be really happy to establish contacts in South Africa. It's my first time in this country, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it. But I've been asked about Ukraine, and I will try to limit myself to a few sentences, as you suggested, Leon, although I have a lot to say. So I will probably, speak here as an individual rather than as a journalist or an expert, although, of course, my experience, my professional experience will also be present in what I'm going to say. So as a personal person and as a Ukrainian, I think I represent that so-called independence generation, people who were born just before or immediately after the Ukraine's independence in 1991. And I remember when I was 6 and I went to the referendum with my parents, in which they were going to vote to support Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union. Well, I was too little to understand the significance, the political significance of that event, but I remember from the way my parents talked to me about it and all the festive atmosphere that was surrounding it, that it was something very important, that Ukraine was gaining its independence. This was something that so many people cared about, struggled for, fought for, and finally this was happening. And then when I grew older, when I was a student, I participated in the Orange Revolution in 2004, when Ukrainians fought against the rigged elections, basically demanding a new round of elections. And basically, they went to the square to demand democracy. That was the first kind of attempt, the first mass protest in independent Ukraine, well, mass protest of that scale, in which Ukrainians also very clearly stated that they care about democracy, that they care about free elections, that, they care about freedom of speech. And they succeeded. And I think that experience empowered me and gave me this firm belief that I share and millions of Ukrainians share, that people have power, that people's actions can make a difference. So if people unite and fight for something, then they can really bring about change. And I think this is something that people in South Africa can also relate to, right? This experience of fighting for a cause, for experience of uniting to achieve a common goal. This is something that unites Ukrainians and South Africans. And then, of course, the Revolution of Dignity in 2004, again, yet another manifestation that people can have power. But your question was about how Russia's invasion changed Ukraine. Well, here I want to make it clear that Russia's invasion did not start in 2022. It started in 2014 as a direct reaction to a Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity and the escape of pro-Russian president and also the course for democracy that Ukraine chose then. So Russian aggression started in 2014, and also in 2014, despite the Russian aggression, started a very profound transformation of the Ukrainian society and Ukraine in general. And by this transformation, which was already mentioned by several speakers on the previous panels, I mean the movement towards greater transparency of state institutions, Dzvinka mentioned the e-governance, a lot of reforms against corruption, and to increase the transparency in public procurement were introduced, a greater decentralization of the country, and also, of course, the greater strengthening of the Ukrainian armed forces and the crystallization of Ukrainian identity, which I would say a political identity. It's not based on ethnicity or on language. It's a political identity, and people who identify as Ukrainians might represent different ethnic groups. They can be Tatars or Romanians or Moldovans, or they can be ethnic Russians, Belarusians, ethnic Greeks, Hungarians, and so on. But what unites them is their desire to live in a free country, which has its agency and which has a right to determine its course, its foreign policy course, and also its internal policy course. So I would say this transformation of Ukraine that has been happening for the last 9 years is something that has been very much overlooked in the rest of the world. And that's why this resistance that Ukrainians showed to Russian aggression, it caught many by surprise, because Russian propaganda and also the maybe lack of study of Ukraine, not as an object, but as a subject, was not sufficient to make both the academic circles and politicians and in general, the general public in other countries realize what modern Ukraine is and how important this and how strong civil society inside Ukraine is, and also how different from Russia current Ukraine is. So I'll be happy to elaborate, but I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a great intro because, I mean, what's notable is that you didn't just focus on post-February 2022 and so much of the media coverage today focus on that period and what happens after that. But this is part of a long ongoing struggle for Ukrainians from that perspective, of course. David, let's turn to you, and we're giving you a very difficult job because we're going to ask you to talk about a variety of issues from a variety of perspectives. And I just want to tell the audience, Professor Ezike and I tried very hard to get some ANC officials or government folks to the panel, but it was difficult. So I'm not going to. So you might get more questions than what you expected earlier. But David, why don't you tell us what are the prevailing viewpoints held by African nations regarding this ongoing Russia-Ukraine war? How have African countries generally reacted to the war, and how is this war generally covered in the media? What type of angle do journalists take?
Thank you. Firstly, two things that I need to clear. I'm the director for the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. It's quite important that I clear that. Two, a friend of mine, as I was driving here, called me to say, I saw where you're going, and aren't you walking into an ambush? I said, listen, a very good friend of mine, Chris, called me. It was a short notice, but given our closeness, Chris and I accepted on the basis that I organize conferences, and therefore, so I thought I should just clear that. I'm not easily scared of walking into ambush, but there are a number of things that I would like to say. Firstly, Africa is at a critical moment at the moment. I cannot speak for the entire continent. There are different views within the continent, 55. However, there is a rallying point, and I shall concentrate on those points as per the African Union Agenda 2063. And in my own country, South Africa, position in terms of issues and the like. So from what I hear in the previous session, I do not think South Africa or across the continent differ with what has already been said. Super sensitive to colonialism of any nature by anyone. Colonialism from the West and colonialism within Eastern Europe and everywhere else. And we are, as Africans, a byproduct of that exploitation and super exploitation, from slavery to colonialism, though physically colonized by Europe, which a speaker in the previous session said France still has its knee on the neck of Africans. So we're not theorizing, we're speaking practically, that we are dealing with vestiges of colonialism, mainly by Europe. I think we need to clear that up. When it comes to Ukraine, Soviet Union is of greatest importance. But when I say Soviet Union, I know you all jump to Russia. Soviet Union as in collective body of all those countries. So the political Soviet Union is what we're now talking of Russia, because most organizations, particularly the SACP, ANC, its alliance was with the Russia, the Communist Party of Russia. So it is carries the memory of Soviet Union, and the alliance signed by ANC are still and remain strong with that particular political body. So I needed to qualify so that we all are on one page. And indeed, when it comes to geographical spread of Soviet Union, no doubt, ANC liberation movements, the training were done in a number of areas. As a matter of fact, in 1927, one of the ANC leaders was in Lithuania, actually, met Stalin, and he came back, Joshua Gumede, and he made a profound statement at Cape Town University Airport. He said, I've been to New Jerusalem. And that statement, if you Google Gumede, New Jerusalem, where he saw the help, the makeup of then Soviet Union after 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, he understood that South Africa and the entire continent need to aspire to the aspiration of then Soviet Union at that time. So it's quite interesting that we need to always constantly become time travelers. We need to go back and we speed back to this moment to really make sense of what's happening now. And I think there has been a number of controversial issues, because on one hand, there is Ukraine crisis, which has been, I share all the views, and my colleague. But I think from a South Africa continent, we're also looking at it from a geopolitics level. That while on the ground there are issues, genuine issues and differences, we also see super imperialism sketching itself, particularly NATO. I haven't had anyone talk about NATO. I came late. Maybe you mentioned. There is fear on part of South Africa and the continent, the so-called global NATO. Because if you go back in 2011, NATO bombed the hell out of Libya, and the crisis in Libya spreading into Sahel. The very same NATO has been carrying imperialistic agendas across the world. And it's moving into Asia. It's moving in a number of areas. So that, I think, is one area that most analysts, when you hear talk about Ukraine, tend to go back to that in terms of Gorbachev agreements with Bush, the father, that NATO should not spread its wings into closer to Russia. So that view, that there are certain areas of where both ANC, Africa have convergence with Russia, and there are areas where both ANC government and the African Union are convergence their views with Ukraine. So both South Africa and AU find themselves in between fighting partners, fighting both our allies, and they're fighting. It's one of the most difficult. I think we face similar situation with China and India. These are our bosom friends. I mean, India and China. You can't separate them when it comes to South Africa and Africa's liberation. However, when they're on each other's neck, we just look at them and say, listen, you are both our brothers and sisters, and we do not take sides. Because we think that firstly, we are anti-war, We are anti-human rights abuses. We are pro-international law. And our foreign policy since 1994 has been consistent, regardless of erosion of some of our policies, particularly under the President Jacob Zuma up to now. There's something that is fundamental in our foreign policy. It has been consistent. It has never eroded. If you look at President Ramaphosa's recent speech within the United Nations General Assembly, you read that speech. That speech could have been read by President Mandela. It could have been read by President Mbeki. And that gives you a consistent in views of our foreign policy. There are no contradictions. South Africa's position on the war believes strongly that Russia violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and no doubt about it. But at the same time, South Africa is concerned about the historical, not relation with the Ukraine, but the NATO dimension part of it is equally worrying, particularly at the party level. I doubt very much at the government level that we see this spread of NATO, because we are victims of that. We're as much close to United States, and we're close to China, we're close to all parties. And our position does not differ from India, for instance. So my closing statement is that when you look at India's position, it's unfortunate that given South Africa's, it's a small country in relation, India expresses its foreign policy much better than South Africa. And I think the world, including our partners from Eastern Europe, tend to be very unkind in how they respond to South Africa, because South Africa is saying nothing new. South Africa is saying nothing that India and quite a number of other, Brazil, are the same position, same views at a multilateral level, bilaterally. There are a number of issues. So for us to untangle them in a very short space of time becomes a problem. So the view is we are anti-war, human rights violation, imperialism, and gravely concerned about this big power beyond Ukraine and Ukrainian people. So that's my opening statement.
Thank you, David, and thank you for joining us, also stepping into the lion's den, as you said. I'm now going to turn to Ambassador Jankauskaitė. Now, again, congratulations on your being officially accredited. And while we're talking about NATO, Lithuania is a relatively small country, but a very important NATO member state also. And you have been one of the greatest supporters of Ukraine in its current struggle against Russian aggression. Can you share your perspective on why is it so important for Lithuania to support Ukraine during this particular period? Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for a warm welcome. And just first of all, I want to say that I see this conference. It's kind of not like comparison of our histories, but it's more here to hear each other in order we could understand each other better. And coming to your question, coming from the Eastern Europe, we see this whole situation a little bit differently, and it's as already been touched upon about our history and being part of the Soviet Union. You've heard that already, and Lithuania constantly feels directly threatened by Russia, even though we are 30 years already independent country. And now Lithuanians worry that what's happening in Ukraine, it could happen in Lithuania. That's why, since this last aggression happened in 2002, just 22, if you would go to Vilnius and outside Vilnius, you will see the whole city covered in Ukrainian flags. And here we are speaking not only that how the government feels, but the ordinary citizens. And that's why, ordinary citizens arranges a lot of crowdfunding campaigns in order to buy some military equipment for Ukrainians. That's kind of as I said, just as we feel that the threat is kind of on our border, that's why our wording is stronger, that's our stance is stronger, and that we kind of feel very obliged to be more vocal on Ukraine. And we could see, that we understand that by resisting Russia, we kind of we understand that Ukraine defends not only our security or European security, but also very important principles, values of whole democratic world, and it's very, very important. And also international rules-based order, which is kind of the, we see that Russia has challenged this arrangement that helped to secure peace for over 70 years, and it's that's very, very important from our point of view.
Thank you, Rasa. Let's move to Bohumil. Thank you again for joining us also. I don't know if you arrived straight from the Czech Republic or whether you were in the area.
I arrived from Czech Republic.
Okay, good. Welcome. Okay, now as a researcher from the Czech Republic, how does the historical context of Central Europe inform your perspective on Russia's actions in Ukraine and this idea of a colonial discourse?
Yeah, so once again, thank you for invitation. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm very glad that so many of you took your time to be here with us. I know that majority of you probably studied extensively the Czech and Czechoslovak history, but I need to give a short excursus into the history to highlight how we perceive this issue. And unlike what was said previously by my Lithuanian and Ukrainian colleagues, we're never part of the Soviet Union, and actually our exposure to Russia or the Soviet Union is quite limited to the 20th century, because previously to that, our part of Europe was mainly dominated by Germany, by Austria-Hungary. We gained the independence only in 1918. And Russia was this, let's say, a distant country that part of the then emerging Czech or Czechoslovak elite seen as a possible counterpoint to the Western Europe. This pan-Slavic brotherhood would to be created. Russia would bring us the independence, etc., which for me looks a little bit similar to some of the African national liberation movements as well. However, those members of the emerging elite who traveled to Russia quickly realized this is not the way forward, that this is a backward country that has nothing to offer. And we basically stayed away from the Russian-Soviet influence up until, let's say, the end of the Second World War, where even throughout the Nazi Germany occupation, we blamed the Western partners not for helping us, not the Soviet Union, because no one really expected the Soviets to come to help us because we are a completely different part of Europe. We went under the Soviet colonial, let's say, influence, this is probably the best word, after the Second World War, with a direct military occupation following 1968. The only reason for the military occupation was that the regime wanted to change slightly. It wasn't to go to the West, it wasn't to change the communist regime, nothing like that. Just wanted to reform a bit in several aspects. Soviet Union couldn't really accept that, interfered. At that point, even the idealists in the Communist Party said, okay, this is probably not the way forward. We went under basically direct colonial regime until 1989. A big moment of our history is in the beginning of the 1990s, the shipment of the last Soviet troops out of the country. The ending of this decolonization process for us is basically entrance into NATO as only clear way how to protect ourselves against a possible reincursion. And this is where I would disagree with what you said, that NATO shouldn't expand to the east, because first of all, this pact between George Bush and Gorbachev that is used mainly by the Russian government, first of all, wasn't done between the presidents. It, even according to the official Russian interpretation, took place between lower level governing officers. Second of all, even Gorbachev said that it never took place, which is very important from this point of view. And third of all, it was never written anywhere. And looking at the amount of agreements, written official agreements that Russia has broke, this seems like a very vague excuse why to interfere into another country. And the only reason why the Eastern European Central and Eastern European countries, because we don't consider ourselves to be part of Eastern Europe, but rather Central Europe, are joining NATO in such numbers, is that it brings us the only effective protection against Russian reincursion. We have seen that the principles of international law are not being followed by Russia. We have seen it in Georgia in 2008. We've seen it in Ukraine following 2014. And especially for the Baltic states, there was a huge rush to get into NATO. For us, it was the same. At that point, our president, Václav Havel, who is a huge pacifist, was the greatest supporter of our incorporation into NATO, simply because he's seen this as the only guarantee against us ever being involved in a great war in Europe. And to continue with the current hot phase or major escalation of the Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2022, this narrative of 1968, the Soviet invasion into Czechoslovakia, was used quite extensively and it's used up until today. We didn't defend ourselves at that point because no one would come to our help. It would be a futile fight. But here we have a very similar situation when a country tried to defend its internal choices against an external aggressor. We can help. And you can see this sentiment being very strong in these countries that separated themselves from the Soviet influence or membership in the Soviet Union. This is actually where we can make the difference. This is where we can finally make the stance, because throughout significant events throughout the 20th century, we didn't have the choice. Was it the Second World War? Was it the Cold War? Etc. Now, suddenly we can do the difference. We have these memories of different invasion, not only us, but also, for example, Hungary is a bad example right now, but you can see these sentiments being reappearing. So this is probably how we perceive the situation. This is why we, in the region, don't see the membership in NATO as something aggressive. It's basically our protection against Russian expansionism. And we can see the same in Ukraine. If you look at the opinion polls, Ukrainians in majority didn't want to join NATO prior to 2014. After 2014, the support in the general population to NATO membership got into majority. Now it's about 80-90%, something like that. So it's a clear reaction to the Russian aggression, not the other way around, from the Eastern and Central European point of view.
Thank you. And I do welcome a lot of disagreement on this panel. And as we go along, we can definitely add our 2 cents to the debate. Did you want to say?
Yeah, just I want to add, can I imagine how it will be Lithuania if we would today, if we are not be members of NATO? I have a strong feeling that we may see Russian troops in Lithuanian territory.
Okay. David? It's a hot topic, so I'll have to...
Yeah. Listen, for us, and for me in particular, NATO in its current configuration, in terms of action, I know why NATO was established, and in the post-Cold War, there was absolutely no need of it. And given its role in Africa, we find it as an imperialist tool, and therefore, I would like us to disagree respectfully that how we see this formation in armed camps and the role that they play at the global level. We are victims of NATO. It's a colonialist, imperialist force that entered Libya, bombed the hell out of a state, killed Muammar Gaddafi. So we can't hide that. And we can't say we want to Of course, you have different views of NATO. So that action is the action of NATO that is we are opposed to. That it cannot spread its view of establishing camps everywhere and dominance. So it's all about dominance at a global level. So my view of NATO in your part of the world, I understand fully, and you have good views why you want to embrace it. But respect and understand the Africa's position based on experience, not theory.
All right, we'll come back. I want to tease out a number of other things also, but I think it is really important that we also distinguish on this panel between NATO and Russia, between Ukraine and NATO, because Ukraine is not NATO, and I think there's, we definitely need to tease that out. I hope Olga will also shed light on that. But I think the point is taken on the issue of how this is seen. Is this an act of anti-imperialism by Russia, by some African countries, or is this seen as a colonial war, which I think is more the Ukrainian position? So let's talk about that a little bit, because what's interesting is that you haven't heard much about Russian colonialism until relatively recently, and you hear more and more Ukrainians talking about that, especially post-February 2022, despite the fact, as you said, that the war started much earlier than that. So, Olga, can you shed some light in terms of that? What is it that you're thinking when Ukrainians talk about that, and how important is it that you frame it in that manner as a Ukrainian?
Sure, thank you. Well, I just want to add some hopefully last words on the topic of NATO, and we'll close it. And it's related actually to the topic of colonialism, so I'll try to make a swift, smooth shift. So I would like to question the entire premise that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was somehow related to NATO, to NATO's expansion, or to NATO's actions. Because if we look at Russia's dictator Putin's speech when he announced the start of the invasion on February 24th, 2022, and if we look at the article he published the summer before in 2021, in those speeches and in that speech and in that article, he basically questioned the right of Ukraine to have an independent state. He questioned Ukrainian statehood. He questioned the existence of distinct Ukrainian identity. And I think that gives us an idea that actually this war has an imperialist nature. This war has a colonial nature. Russians, also in Russian state media, in speeches by other Russian politicians, in even the views of ordinary Russians, if you talk to them, you would often hear this point that, well, Ukraine is an artificial country. Ukraine is an artificial state. Ukrainian language is some sort of like a funny creation, a dialect. Ukrainian culture never existed. And indeed, Russia appropriated a lot of Ukrainian artists and writers, like Malevich, for example, who is known in the world as a Russian artist, but he was a Ukrainian. And it's just one of countless examples. So I think that is actually the main motivation behind this war, not some sort of, NATO's actions. Also, because if Russia was really that concerned with NATO's enlargement, and I would prefer this word to expansion, because expansion is something imposed. And as my colleague said, countries of Central and Eastern Europe voluntarily applied to join NATO, so it wasn't imposed on them, because they see it, as Ukrainians see it now, as and the only deterrent against aggressive Russia. So if NATO enlargement was such a concern to Russia, then why Finland joining NATO didn't cause a lot of objections from the Russian government. So actually, as a result of Russian aggression of Ukraine, NATO not only got farther away from Russia, it actually extended its border with Russia for more than 1,000 kilometers. So I would entirely question the whole premise of NATO somehow being responsible for Russia's actions or NATO provoking Russia. And of course, we can't deny that the actions of the West or NATO, they caused a lot of damage to Africa and to other parts of non-Western world. And we as, I think, Ukrainians and Central and Eastern Europeans have to learn more. It's our kind of obligation also, if we want to understand why other countries take positions they take, we need to understand their history and their point of view. So I don't want to question that. And it's important for me to hear these points of view, but I also want to get our message across and how we see the situation. To your question, Leon, about the colonialism, so I mentioned that Ukrainians see it, and there have been countless examples also, like Putin comparing what Russia is doing now and what he is doing now to the gathering of Russian lands, as they like to call it, by Peter the Great. So what was it if not an imperialist quest to expand the territory of Russia? So what Russia is doing now is similar to what Russian Empire has been doing in the previous centuries preceding the 20th century. And then, of course, all the policies enacted by the Soviet Union, such as, resettlement, population resettlement, and artificial drawing of borders. We've seen just the conflict playing out in Nagorno-Karabakh. That is a direct result of Stalin's artificial creation of the state borders after the creation of the Soviet Union. So all those actions, they point us directly in the direction of, to call it colonialism. And I think why there is more talk about that and more discussion about Russian colonialism now is also because we as Ukrainians, but also other former states of the Soviet Union, such as Kazakhstan and Belarus, which are under oppression now, but where exist strong anti-government movements, they start to discover their own history, which was not written and narrated by Russia, which is not Russia-centric. So it's not just Ukrainians who are now talking about Russian colonialism, it's also Kazakhs, it's also representatives of other former Soviet republics. Because the languages of minorities in Soviet Union and, the minorities' rights were oppressed all across the Soviet Union. So Russians were prioritized, Russian language was seen as a language. If you want to make a career, if you want to achieve success in the Soviet Union, you had to learn Russian language. And there was also this, and I think, again, something that was mentioned on the panel one, this tendency by the central government in Moscow to kind of present all the other cultures and languages as somewhat inferior and somewhat, like traditional and backward. All this tendency to just dehumanize. I think even this can be applied. So kind of say, well, these are not really real people. So Russian culture, Russian language, Russian identity is the real one. All the other ones, they are not real. We can observe them, we can enjoy them as a performance, but they do not really have a history. They shouldn't have a say. They do not really have an agency. And that's what I think is, gives us reasons to speak about Russian colonialism. And I would like to just name several names of Ukrainian writers, journalists, and my colleagues who write about Russian colonialism, if you are interested to learn more. So my colleague and friend Maxim Aristavi has just published a book on Russian colonialism in which he presents a body of evidence why we can talk about it in relation not just to Ukraine but to other countries of Central Asia and the Baltics and other states of the Soviet Union, and not only, even there are even examples of Russian desire to participate in a scramble for Africa, for example, which many people here might not know about, but it's there, it's mentioned there. And then an essay by Sasha Dovzhik, a Ukrainian researcher with University College London, who wrote about her own personal quest raised in Russian-speaking city of Zaporizhia in south of Ukraine, raised to admire great Russian culture, how then she felt oppressed by Russian culture, by Russian language, how she felt, how much this was imposed on her from outside, how much this inferiority complex as a Ukrainian was cultivated in her. And I think this experience that she describes, it describes the experience of many Ukrainians now. It's not just one person who's undergoing that process of discovery of, their Ukrainian identity, and also discovering the trauma that they and the generation of their parents and grandparents had as a result of Soviet-Russian oppression. Okay.
Thank you, Olga. I'm sure you're going to get more questions on that also. David, let's turn to you again. I'd be very interested to hear whether you think it's worthwhile or fair or unfair to liken Russia's actions today with colonialism. Where do you stand on that issue?
I think my opening was quite clear that we are opposed to any form of racism, colonialism, and I added imperialism, and in any form and by anyone. And therefore, I think in our struggle, we've always been on the side of those who are at the receiving end. And our alliances are with those who are suffering. Western Sahara, Palestinian, and oh, you want me to say Ukraine?
For those who are suffering.
Okay, Ukraine people, yeah, that were bombed, and of all makeup, Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who are also bombed within Ukraine itself.
By Russia, not NATO. Just to make clear.
We are anti-bombs. Whether those bombs are manufactured in Russia or United States.
Not manufactured.
No. Let me be very clear. You're speaking for me. I'm saying we are pro-human rights. And we are pro-freedom. So when you say as a Ukrainian you want freedom, we are with you. But we are always saying that please appreciate the suffering that we have faced from Europe and from NATO, which you are not. So that brings me to Africa. Why everyone wants to quote Africa, and everyone, whenever issues come in, they run to Africa. We are 55 countries, 1.3 billion people. We have rich mineral resources, and our people are the greatest assets we have. And we have fertile land. And we don't enjoy our resources for centuries. Our people were taken as slaves. So I think at this stage, as Africa, we find no one who can teach us about human rights, freedom, democracy, and victimhood. We suffered through centuries. So all what we are saying is that we want to work with everyone in the world to build a better world through disarmament. We gave up nuclear. So you're talking 1990. We also gave up nuclear. We had nuclear in this country. We abide by international law. We think that United Nations itself, it's not in any form representing Africa. We have no representation there. Europe is overrepresented. And there's no reforms. And you speak as if that is not human rights violation. So you have absolutely no moral right or standing to teach Africa about human rights, democracy, freedom. Because these are things that we went to war to liberate ourselves. And we're saying having a government and a flag, that's not the end of our struggle. It's entering into economic, fair trade. We entering in a number of areas. As we speak, we have foreign forces on our land. Not just Wagner that you're interested in. We have foreign, all governments, Germans, Japanese are on our continent. What are they looking for? Americans, they have their camps everywhere. They want our resources to exploit them. So we are anti that, so that if you talk about these issues, you need to have a collective way of saying we share these issues. You should also be in the forefront. The manner in which our people were treated in Poland, a plane stuck for days, that's racism of its worst form. And we need to be speaking about those issues in an open, in an academic setting. So it's not that we're insensitive to the Ukrainian as you try to portray my views. We are not. We're just saying, let us not form camps and have dominance of one particular continent over others. So Russia has issues with its neighbors. They need to be resolved peacefully. That's all what we're saying. We're not saying Russia is right, nor are we saying Ukraine is right. We want a peaceful resolution of that conflict, as much as in Western Sahara, as much as in Palestine, in so many other places where the people's rights are violated. We are in the forefront. That's what our policy as South Africa and the African continent stands. So I think I'm very clear on that.
Yes, I think so. Let's pick up on that particular point, that David mentioned. This is a question for you, Rasa. On this war being framed as an anti-imperialist war from the perspective of Russia. Where do you stand on that? I mean, you touched on it a little bit earlier also when you said, think about where Lithuania would be today if it didn't join NATO, but maybe you could expand a little bit on this argument.
It's, I even don't know where to start, just from the first, last point what David made, about peaceful resolution with Russia on the conflict, it's, here we are speaking about Russian-Ukrainian issue right now, and the thing is, that the war started not in 2022. The war started much earlier, when alarming already was the situation when Russia attacked Georgia in 2008. And then, we had another attack in 2000, Russians attack on Crimea and parts of Donbass on 2014. And, during all the time, just a lot of international efforts were made, to speak with Russia and to solve these situations peacefully. And, it's been done in multilateral forums. It will be done bilaterally by many countries. But somehow, it didn't take us anywhere. Kind of there. We end up with February 2022. And that's why, to speak now about a peaceful resolution, it would be very difficult. And coming to the question about Lithuania's view on conflict as anti-imperialist war, there is argument that kind of NATO expansion or enlargement was a provocative factor, but Olga already touched upon this, and kind of I can subscribe to each word what she said, and I don't have much to say. Just we see the situation absolutely different, and it's this war has nothing to do with NATO enlargement. It's exactly that we see that Russia's imperialistic ambitions provoked that war, and exactly Putin's speeches and public speeches and articles confirms that, as he speaks about reconquering territories of the Peter Great and etc. That's why I think, just hearing these speeches, all Lithuanians are very concerned, and just then what I said in the beginning, just that's why a lot of Lithuanians are very worried and feel threatened, directly threatened by Russia. And just it's we still feel, Russia as an imperialistic power, and like an empire with resembling 19th century empires of European continent, and Russia still has this DNA, and it acts like an empire.
Let's turn now again to you, Bohumil. If you want to pick up on any of the sort of framing this war as a anti-imperialist war or an imperial war, whatever that is, feel free to piggyback on some of those ideas. But I'm keen to hear from you how you think this war is impacting on geopolitics, just to kind of open up the debate a little bit, and I would be interested to hear from you, why should people in Africa care about what is happening very far away from here?
Sure. So first of all, I will just make one short remark regarding NATO, because I agree with David that we need to pay attention to the African dimension, and I agree with him that we need to hold an open academic discussion. And my one point is that I agree with you that numerous NATO members did a terrible job in African continent after the end of the Cold War. Prior to that, there is no saying about it. It's obvious. However, I would really stress to make a difference between NATO as this boogeyman, as often portrayed, and the NATO members, because NATO is a defensive alliance. The fact that some of its members have conducted some aggressive operations, as you mentioned, doesn't mean that this was a NATO decision. NATO is a defensive pact, and this is something that I feel is often missing from the debates regarding the Western interactions with Africa, which are very problematic, especially the French activities on the continent are very problematic. I would 100% agree. However, this is not a NATO who would be interfering. It's our selected NATO members, because they are not bound in their foreign and security policies by NATO. NATO is just a defensive alliance in case one of its members is attacked. So I would like to make this distinction. And maybe one more point to this. And this was, I believe this is a joke that was said by President Zelensky a couple of months ago, that there are two guys talking to each other. And have you heard that Russia and NATO are fighting in Ukraine? Oh, how is it going? Russia lost tens of thousands of men, some tanks, a lot of artillery. They cannot proceed any further. What about NATO? They haven't arrived yet. So this is basically how the discussion looks like right now. Regarding what you said, the geopolitical changes in Europe are quite clear. We see a strengthening of the voice of Central and Eastern Europe. That was previously seen as Russophobic. In the end, it was quite clearly realistic, because the different attempts of reset of relationships between NATO and Russia, US and Russia, were always calmed down by the Central Eastern Europeans. Like, we just make sure that Russia will follow through, because they generally don't. In the end, it led to the invasion of Georgia, it led to invasion of Ukraine. So this voice is now much more prominent. The historical experience that we are sharing in here is now taken seriously. We can see a massive expand in military spending. So if, in case Russia was afraid of Europe doing anything prior to 2014, prior to 2022, the European defense industry was basically shattered. The armies were underfinanced, obsolete, etc. Now, numerous countries in Europe are refinancing their armies. They are buying new technology, manufacturing new technology. So we can see the emergence of this as well. And why should Africa care? I absolutely understand the position of numerous African countries on the continent, that you don't want to side with any of the parties. You highlight the peaceful solutions, even though from our point of view it's not possible right now, and that you highlight the African interest, which is logical, and it's very, very, very important to hear this voice as well. However, why I feel the experience of Central and Eastern Europe is important is to understand some of the Russian policies in Africa. And when we look, for example, at the case of Central African Republic, this is a great case of colonial expansion. What is Russia doing in Central African Republic is basically it protects the seat of power, it protects its extractive industries in the country. It does not deal with stabilizing the country, it does not deal with promotion of human rights, it does not deal with the fact that the state should be providing some services to the population. All it does is keeping President Touadéra in power, having the Russian advisor at his side so he makes the right decisions, exploiting the nature resources the same way the European colonialists did in the past and French are doing in some parts of Africa up to this point, without any stabilization of the situation, to the point when last year it was reported, I believe, by the United Nations, that in Central Africa in 1 year lost 5% of its total population in 1 year, which is twice as much as the other worst country in the world. And I believe this is important not to force the, let's say, European view on African countries, because that would be uncalled for. However, just to highlight the threat that Russia is posing and the fact that it is actually an aggressive imperial power, and that in some ways this voice should be also considered by the African states when they make their own decisions, not to force any Western views on that. And this was very much picked up at the beginning of the recent escalation in 2022 by the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, who basically made the same statement. So this would be my point. Why should Africa care about what we are saying in here?
Do you have a quick
it's quite, you know what, yeah, my name is David, so you can understand. I've got a religious background. I'm always told not to be more Catholic than the Pope. So I always know my position and my space. Okay, since you brought in Central Africa, we can go back to the 60s. Patrice Lumumba, a Democrat, human rights, was murdered with the help of CIA, Belgium, European countries. Let's go to Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara. I don't know how much time you have. So I think the point I'm getting at is that we are 100% opposed to foreign involvement on the African continent. And I need to repeat that. And I repeat that it is not just the Russians who arrived yesterday. Europeans have been here for decades, and they continue to be here. And what I'm opposed to what you're saying is that you have this window, close the European window, look at Russia. I'm just saying, no. These are two devils for Africa. And we're opposed to involvement of foreign forces because they are all the same. Wagner, the French, whoever involvement are here to take resources from the continent, nothing else. So you can't say the others are better devils and this one is the worst one. You must look, we're looking at this collectively. We're opposed as African Union to foreign bases, foreign military interventions on the African continent, period. Africa is for Africa. Africa has agents. They know what they want in the world, what they want for themselves. And they have positions which are very clear. So when we talk about this, we are opposed. We are not in any way close to Russia and embrace Russia's Wagner groups and other forces. We are opposed to it, 100%. President Putin knows that. And equally, NATO and everyone else are as bad as Wagner. That's what we want to say. And I wanted you to have said that. And you are not. Your forces were here, are here. They were in Libya. You can't say it's just France. Go back and read Libya 2011. Who constituted the force that bombed the hell out of Libya? Our president had to ask for airspace to enter in African airspace in Libya.
All right, let's...
So I think, no, I know it's uncomfortable, but we need to air it. And we say this in a respectful way. So when we discuss these things, let's be holistic and put everything on the table as it is. This selective morality of looking at one side, it's problematic. That's the point I'm making.
I just want us to be careful to make whataboutisms.
No, there's nothing whataboutism.
But because I do think, I hold dual citizenship, so I'm South African and I'm American. I was very much opposed to the Iraq invasion and Afghanistan and so on, but I'm also very much opposed to this, war in Ukraine. So you've said earlier, the main point is that you draw a thick line in the sand when it comes to human rights abuses, to violence, to intervention, and those kind of things. So let's focus on that. But your point is also that, of course, and this is a really important point that we have to understand, that Europeans also have to understand, that informs African perspectives, is that there is a long history of oppression on the continent, and that also informs how decisions are made today. But I do think that the Ukrainians are also asking that, don't look beyond what they are, experiencing, and just to take a one-sided perspective on history. Who inherited the Soviet Union embassy building here? It was Russia. And throughout the continent is very much the same thing also. So, and I get the perception that in South Africa often the positive things that are associated with the Soviet Union is directly attributed to Russia, irrespective of the fact that you had fighters also who were ANC officials and MK fighters and so on that received education and training in Ukraine, for example. But I do want to open, and I don't want to gang up to
No, it's okay. I'm used to it.
I agreed with many of your points also. I do, and I think this panel is going to get some really tough questions. I have a ton of more questions, but I do want to open it up. I want to ask, though, before you ask your question, just state your name, your affiliation very briefly, and ask a question. Don't make like a long statement. You have 30 seconds to ask that question. So just let's take about 4 questions or so. Can I just see by show of hands who would like? Oh, and please tell us who the question is directed at, so that it's to a specific person, please.
And spread them.
Spread them out. Any questions? Oh, over here. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Ekumse. I'm a student at the University of Pretoria, Department of Political Sciences. I know the second panel is discussing Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a form of colonialism. And I could hear Professor David's position very clearly, but now I'm worried. If South Africa is really standing against all forms of colonialism around the world, how is South Africa displaying this on the continent, with particular reference to the ongoing colonialism in the Amazonian area in Cameroon? Because you have mentioned the Western Saharan region. Is that the only place where there is conflict on the continent? Because I know that South Africa is maintaining good relations with the Cameroon government, even when the Cameroon government has, in the last 5 to 6 years, been killing the people of Amazonia who are only demanding sovereignty. Thank you so much.
More questions? See. Do you want to answer that in the meantime, Professor?
I know there are a lot of issues happening on the continent. I'm not particularly familiar with that specific. I followed what's happening in Cameroon with a historical fight of French-speaking and English-speaking. And I wish if Professor Chris, because he's from that part of the world, with a much better understanding of the nuances. And on the African continent, I think South Africa's views are in line with the AU. And the violation of human rights in that part of the world, if it's taking place, it has to be opposed by everyone. So I can't speak on South African government position. You have more evidence that you need to show, and we're opposed to the fight. That's all.
We have a question up here. Yes, and we can't hold you accountable, Professor, for every government position.
Dzvinka Kachur, research fellow at the Center for Sustainability Institute, Stellenbosch University. I have a question to all panelists. We hear here like how often Eastern European countries or European countries are referencing to Africa as a continent. And here we hear the same about the Europe, because even Eastern Europe have never participated in any kind of colonization. Now when we say like, oh, you Europeans, the South African perception is that it's all European. So you don't distinguish who was also under oppression, who was not. How do you think we can change that narrative that the Eastern Europeans see African continent as a collective 55 countries, and the same for South African governments, that it distinguish that Ukraine has been part of the Soviet Union, suffered from the oppression, now fighting for its freedom, and that also, like maybe a short question about the South African consistency. If we say that South African government is so vocal about Palestine, it was vocal against Iraq, but it's silent on the question of Ukraine because it did not vote in the UN. It's abstained, so it's not really a consistent position. We can't say that this is consistent if we are inviting Russian military warship with the signs of war to peaceful waters of Atlantic and Indian Ocean and promoting it here, promoting Russian propaganda. I think if South Africa and other African countries don't say no to this oppression and support this propaganda, this war going to continue longer.
I have a question here,
yeah,
and one back there also.
Okay, I think that she has actually asked the question I wanted to ask around the consistency of South Africa's foreign policy as when it comes to the question of Ukraine. I don't think that there's been consistency there, especially with the question of South Africa's foreign policy is anti-war, right? It's clear. It's clearly stated in foreign policy white paper. And so if there is a war in Ukraine, if it is principled, it should be able to clearly say we oppose this war and actually vote to say so. But that does not mean that then South Africa is enemies with Russia. It doesn't mean that. And I think it's part of the colonial mentality where we do not recognize our power, our agency, not power, as Africans, and as such are not able to speak quite boldly because we do not recognize our agency. If we do, we should be able to look Russia in the eye and say, we do not support war as a foreign policy principle. You've taken war to Ukraine. We do not want to question how that started, who started it, when. But the point is that you invaded a country and violated their sovereignty. And for that, we would vote to condemn it. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we will not be part of BRICS. It doesn't mean that we will not welcome you to our country if you want to come to our country. I think we should be able to separate this. But I think the question I would then want to ask is whether this panel has been able to answer the question of whether Russian aggression against Ukraine is a form of colonialism. This is the one question that I want the panel to just try and speak to very directly, yes or no.
That's the right question still. And then we have a student over there.
I'm Amanda Klele, and I'm a student here at the University of Pretoria. I'm a student of political science. And this question is largely directed to our European guests. And I mean, I'm going to preface it by saying every sovereign state has the ability and the agency to take defensive measures, and that much I understand and I acknowledge and I encourage you to do. But I think past the immediate threat, past the immediate threat of Russian invasion, what is there a need for prolonged defensive measure? Because it almost seems as though there is some, I'm going to call it a boogeyman in this case, that we keep saying there will be some threat from somewhere, so we always have to be defensive, when in some cases defensive measures doesn't necessarily have to be preparations for war or preparations for invasion, but rather proactively trying to ensure that there is more unity and peace within Europe, and also between the Europeans and the African states. It seems that there only seems to be a call for defense in the case of war, instead of using other measures as defensive measures.
All right. Let's start, maybe, shall we start on the far left and then work our way towards this way?
Far right.
I'll give... You said it. I'll sit in the middle there. Maybe let's take about 2 to 3 minutes per response, and then we can do another question. Let's hit hard on what Professor Ezekiel also asked on really answering this question on the colonial question. So.
Right. What I marked the first question was how we change situation that African countries wouldn't take us as...
that Lithuania wouldn't see Africa as a whole continent. In that sense.
How do you get there's this campaign, Africa is not a country.
Right.
How do you get the same situation for all these various Central and Eastern European countries to view them also as different from one another, that it's not just the West is one thing, but there's a lot of diversity in that package?
Right.
Europe.
We just have to speak to each other more, and I think this conference is kind of the one of the things when we sit at the same panel with very different perspectives, with very different views, and we agree to disagree, and I think it's very much contribute to better understanding about a continent as such as very individual countries as well. Should we take question by question?
You can select which ones you wanna hone in on. If there's anything else that's important to you that you heard from the questions, please.
Yeah, and it was one question about neutrality of the countries. Somehow, the current situation, again, just reminds me, our fight for independence, for freedom back in the 1990s. And Lithuania was the first country which declared independence from the Soviet Union. And myself, I remember this time very well. And at that time, there were some countries who kind of tried to stop us, or, they said that we don't need to do that. And it was a big question for me why some countries would wish that some kind of the small country wouldn't have self-determination right for freedom, and could be independent state, and I just can't find one answer, that it was a big fear, a big fear how the whole geopolitics will change, and how Soviet Union would respond, and I can feel today, with the situation in Ukraine, there is a lot of fear for some international actors. What will happen if Ukraine wins, and I think just it's not the right power what drives thinking of some countries, and just as our situation showed that even just you have a big neighbor, it's nothing to fear, and just your way to freedom, it's the only way. Yeah, maybe I will pass.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Maybe hit hard, especially on the question also on what Central Eastern European countries have done to, other than preparing for war, to build the relationship with Russia, because I do think there's a lot of discussion on that issue, and then of course the key question on colonialism also, please.
So I will start with the two because they will be
Sure.
briefer, and then return to the last question.
Okay.
What we can do, take Africa seriously, because this is something that our part of the world didn't do, and I believe this is why we perceive still it wasn't our priority, and even coming through the Czech educational system, we have never learned properly anything about the African continent, about its history, whatever. So if we want to get a better understanding of the continent, we need to incorporate it more into the education. We need to propagate the topics more into the public space, etc. So this is what we can do, and what we can do for us to be perceived as different countries by our African partners is, once again, to, as was mentioned, communicate, be present, talk to the people, promote the different views, and I believe that I would agree with that. This is the only way how we can make this distinction, is to be heard, to be respectful, and to take the partner seriously, because this is something I'm afraid wasn't being really done in the past. Regarding your question, yes, I believe it is a colonial war, and I would leave it at that, because otherwise we would get into the whole other discussion. And regarding what have been done, actually, if you look at the history of dealing with the CE countries, with Russia, after the end of the Cold War, the military option was always the last resort. Like, we entered NATO because it gave us some protection in case there would be an attack, but we didn't do anything substantive with it. It was like, yeah, US will come to help, it's fine. Like, we don't have to do anything. And even NATO was engaging with Russia. There was standing NATO-Russia Council. We engaged Russia economically. There was quite a lot of economic ties. There were some common projects. For example, the space project of the European Space Agency was tied to Russia quite a lot. European Space Agency was using repurposed Russian launchers up until 2022. So there was a lot of attempts to make other things work to bring Russia closer. However, they were very often misused by Russia, which didn't bring a lot of benefits. Obviously, there were some economic benefits, some important economic benefits that obviously went through the roof after 2022. However, if you look at the military side of it, the first time there was some meaningful presence of non-Baltic NATO troops in the Baltic states was only after 2014 as a reaction to the aggression against Ukraine. So it wasn't like a preparation for the war before Russia did something. It was like realization that with the current defense structure, if Russia does exactly the same what they did in Ukraine and Baltics, we won't be able to defend it. And then the whole structure goes to hell. So we will send some extra troops just to make sure this doesn't happen. So it was basically last resort after like 2 or 3 restarts of the diplomatic relations failed. And the current spur towards militarization of the foreign policy to Russia is once again just following the February 2022. Looking, for example, at the Czech army, we promised to spend at least 2% of GDP to support the armed forces as a NATO requirement way ago. We were never to follow it, like ever. Like, our governments always make some excuses why not to do it. This year, we are almost there, just because of the aggression against Ukraine. So I don't see that there will be a military posture first and then the reaction. It's just that the other options failed to materialize.
Right, thank you. David, maybe if you can focus on, especially hone in on the issue of principles in foreign policy that was asked, and then also the main question, can you talk about Russian colonialism in this context?
Professor Chris knows very well that I disagree with the view that South Africa has been inconsistent. And there is not even a piece of inconsistency that one can find on its position in Ukraine. It has been consistent. President Ramaphosa said it right in the face of President Putin, South Africa's position. And no one can be more clearer than that South Africa is opposed to the war. I think it's a principled position at a time when the world is closing and everyone thinks that peace can only be found through the barrel of the gun. I think South Africa is opposed to that. It's a principled position. That negotiations, peaceful way, as per the DNA of our own country. It was through negotiation, round table. There was no win anyone.
Coinciding with the armed struggle, though.
No. I'm just saying South Africa's foreign policy, its DNA, its peaceful resolution to conflicts, and to demand that it should abandon that. It's like you reject your own DNA. It's difficult to put it. So I think President Ramaphosa has been very clear. And I think he took a position of going to Ukraine and go to Moscow and spoke to all these warring parties to say, this war, no one is going to win. And we still maintain, no one is going to win this war. In the end, there's going to be a peaceful resolution. South Africa's position a year from now, 2 years, we'll sit in this same room, I'll sit on the same chair. The war will end not through the barrel of the gun, not on part of Russia, not on part of Ukraine. Why are we wasting lives? That's South Africa's position. But everyone's views have closed. Some think that tanks and Leopards 2s and F-16 or whatever, or Russia's come with its own views of its own weapons, hypersonic and whatever. It's not going anywhere. No one is going to win. We're going to be all lose-lose. So our position is clear. I don't know from a principle what is a better principle than that. So it has been consistent. I agree with one small element of what you said. The drilling. I'm 100% for South Africa's relationship with all its partners. But I thought the day of the drilling was an element of inconsistent, insensitive, just the day that the drilling was done. It could have been postponed for a week or a month, because the drilling with Russia, the so-called Lady R, it should have taken place. It's part of South Africa's relationship. We drill with Americans. We drill with the French. We drill with everyone. So why shouldn't we drill with the Russians? But to drill it on anniversary day, I thought, personally, I can stand at any platform and say, it was a bad idea, bad decision. You should have postponed this and be sensitive to what is happening. So I think lessons learned going forward. Your question, what should we do? Please don't support wars of choice, of bombing of Libya. Don't support it. No. Let me answer you. You said, what is it Europe can do? Stop the bombing of Syria and stealing of Syria's oil as we speak. You look the other side. No. Hold on. Protect me, Chair. No. I'm answering it. What Europe should do on immigration, treat immigrants equally. They are dying there. You allow them to die. I'm right there. How many thousands are dying? Can I not generalize? Facts. I can give you the numbers if you want. Stop interfering in African states. That drives those people. Support dictators on the African continent. As a result, as you bomb and weapons are no longer stored, they spread into the entire Sahel, up to Nigeria, a strong state. Boko Haram. Weapons are coming from Libya right there. You know about it. But you took a decisive decision to do what you did. And then when massive number of Africans come to your shows, you're no longer talking about human rights. You're saying the only human rights we need to look is one area geographically. We're saying we're concerned about Ukraine crisis as much as we're growing in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in all other. Refugees are the same. Let us not put color of the skin of people so be consistent. Be consistent. Support multilateral to stop wars. Don't support dictators, your chosen dictators, who are killing their people. Okay. On the African continent. You asked a good question. What should Europe do? Do that. Then you're with us in demanding Africa's space within United Nations Security Council. And then we can talk about democracy, fair trade, open up, support refugees everywhere. And don't tell us that in particular areas there are superior refugees than other refugees. So we need to be even-handed in our approach to international relations and fairness. That's all what I can humbly request you to do in Europe, in your discussions, in every way. Don't support imperialism.
Okay, let's turn to Olga for the last intervention.
Yeah, thank you. So I would just like to caution us again against maybe generalizing and saying you Europeans do that, because as my colleague said, Ukrainians are not responsible for many of the policies that were harmful committed by Europeans on the African continent. And we as Ukrainians have deposed our dictator, for example, and our people fought against dictatorship in Ukraine. But of course, the points that are raised are very valid. I would like to start with the question on why do Ukrainians or Eastern Europeans need to be that defensive all the time? And I would agree with the arguments that Bohumil made and also mention two other things. So speaking about concretely Ukraine, the experience of Ukraine in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union is very much different from that of Lithuania or Czech Republic, because Ukraine did not immediately declare its desire to become a part of the EU and NATO, and Ukraine was not on the track to become an EU and NATO member until 2000s. So actually Ukraine immediately after the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union tried to build a friendly relationship with Russia. Ukraine was a neutral country. Ukraine did not aspire to become a NATO member, and that process, as was already mentioned, was actually spurred by Russia's actions. So Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 during the Budapest Memorandum signed by Russia. Ukraine also had countless, dozens, if not hundreds, of bilateral and multilateral agreements with Russia, in which Russia took upon itself an obligation to recognize and respect Ukraine's sovereignty and Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, which Russia subsequently violated. So Ukraine, I think, did a lot to actually, be friendly with Russia, and actually all the decisions that were made subsequently to shift the course towards EU and NATO membership, they were as a result of Russia's actions, as a result of Russia's first attempts to economically to undermine Ukrainian economy through the gas crisis, switching off of gas to Ukraine in early 2000s, in the 1990s, and leading up to 2014. So there were a lot of Russia's attempts to interfere with Ukraine's internal relations before 2014. So when all these attempts failed, then Russia resorted to an overt military aggression back in 2014. As a journalist, I can also say that we shouldn't underestimate Russia's efforts in the information space. I was working as a journalist on Ukrainian television stations in early 2000s, and I've seen Russian nationals, Russian citizens being present on board of every major Ukrainian TV station, dictated the editorial line that had to be pro-Russian, that had to be friendly to Russia. We were not allowed to report on pro-EU demonstrations, even when Maidan started in 2014. So I actually quit one of my jobs in 2014 because of that, because I did not agree with the censorship, with the pro-Russian censorship in Ukrainian media. So that's for the Ukraine's kind of attempts to be friendly with Russia, and how Ukraine's trust into Russia was betrayed by Russia. Then talking about, why also we feel this need of like being defensive in regard to Russia. I think that stems from this systemic nature of Russian oppression against Ukraine and against Central and Eastern Europe, because it has its roots in centuries ago. It was mentioned in the first panel, attempts to ban Ukrainian language, to not allow Ukrainians to higher positions, or somehow to also rewrite Ukrainian history through a Russian lens. And if we are agreeing here that people have a voice and Africans should tell their own history without the colonial Western lens, the same way Ukrainians have a right to tell their history without the Russian imperialist lens. So my answer to the question whether this is a colonial war is absolutely yes, based on this. And I would also share my deepest conviction and my deepest the idea I deeply believe in, that actually the root cause of this war is actually this Russian imperialist attitude and mindset generally of the Russian population. So in my view, it's not just Putin's war, it's the war that is supported by a lot of Russians, because they do not see Ukraine as an independent state, as a state that has a right to exist. And what is this if not, imperialism? What is this if not colonialism? So unless and until that changes, I can see no end to wars of aggression that Russia starts. And I think this is the issue we should be discussing most of all: how to bring about the change in mindset, how to dismantle this last remaining empire that never did any reckoning with crimes it committed. And also, if we are talking about racism in Europe or in Central Europe, I would talk about racism inside Russia, about racism towards people from Central Asian republics, like even Russian opposition leaders who are now in jail. They expressed deeply racist views on people from Uzbekistan, from Tajikistan. There are incidents of racially motivated killings of Africans in Russia. So we shouldn't overlook that and see somehow Russia as free from racism or as anti-Western power which does not have the problems that we complain about the West. So just to conclude, once again, I want to reiterate that Russians, because of the resources they have, the embassies, the money, the contacts that have been created over decades here on the African continent, they are also very skillfully tailoring the messaging to different audiences, both the Russian government but also Russian state-funded propaganda. And we know that Russia has enormous budget for propaganda and disinformation that it uses across the world. So, and one of those messages is actually, making the emphasis on anti-Western sentiment, anti-NATO sentiment that exists here without ever mentioning, Russia's imperialist past, Russia's imperialist present, and Russia's and racism inside Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. Can we just have that microphone here? I just want to recognize the Czech Republic's new ambassador also, who's been accredited also yesterday. Thank you very much also for your support. We had a really great panel here also, I think, and a lot of different views, different perspectives. We respect each other's different views. I think it's been great to engage. I don't know if you want to say just a word, Ambassador Ulichny, on any reflections on this panel for a few seconds before I give the floor to Ukraine's ambassador.
Yeah,
I hope I'm not putting you on the spot.
No, you are not putting me on the spot. On the contrary, I am pleased that I can, participate, and I can also throw a few of my ideas into the basket. I think that there was a passionate discussion amongst you. I followed with the passion, even though I had some phone calls from some other part of the world, not from the Russia, nor from the Ukraine. But let me say just few words. Perhaps contemplating what our participant, the Czech participant, Dr. Doboš, mentioned about our late President Václav Havel, who was a great friend of Nelson Mandela. They met many times, and they shared the views about the pacifism and how to solve the conflicts. Perhaps coming back to early 90s, and perhaps I will rectify a bit Bohumil saying that at the beginning, Václav Havel was very pacifist. He said that both blocs, Warsaw Pact and NATO, should be dissolved. But over the next 5-6 years, he came to the conclusion that for preserving our sovereignty and independence, he has become the staunchest supporter of NATO accession. So from the idealist and pacifist to someone who was very strongly influenced by transatlantic link. He believed in the American presence in Europe and American umbrella for newly independent or democratic countries of the world. And his very last, I think, achievement was the Prague summit in 2002, when the eastern countries like Lithuania have been invited to NATO, because we were in NATO since '99. Decision was taken at Washington Summit '97. And also enriching discussion with Václav Havel statement about Russia. Václav Havel defined Russia as a country who hasn't defined its border in the history. So the problem of Russia was that Russians, they do not know where they starts and where they ends. And when the empire is in a full swing, it inflates. And if it's in decline, it deflates. So after the Second World War, when the Iron Curtain went down, it was clear it was either or, and the Third War, like Africa, was divided amongst the Soviet Union and its satellite, like Czechoslovakia, and the other part of the world, which was also unfamously apartheid state here. So we should also somehow contribute to national liberation of Africa, which is not now recognized by some of the political circles in Africa, that we have also been colonized, and we also contributed by the same way to struggle of African nation to gain the independence in early 60s. Having said so about the Russia and about the border, the vague, blurred border. So the Russia in the 90s, they deflated. But as an empire, the entity of empire is that without expansion, they cannot exist, the elites. So now, or starting, there was a speech of Putin at the Munich Security Conference in 2008, few months before Georgia was attacked, or part of the Georgia was attacked, when he defined the new Russian expansionist foreign policy drive towards Europe. More assertiveness, no more cooperation with you. Because the cooperation hasn't brought any results to us. Our companies are being bought by the Russian. So we can also see the birth of the Russian nationalism rebirth. And then it continues in 2014. I must say, and I admit that many of us were still at the time appeasing the Russia. They believe in peaceful coexistence, even though Russia at that time already clearly violated the international law, invading the Crimea and occupying the Crimea. And I'm not saying that 90% of Crimean inhabitants are of Russian origin. The issue is that for the first time after 1945, one of the guarantor of the Yalta system has violated the international recognized border. And I think that should have been a turning point, which was not. So 8 years ago, we are confronted with the open, clear aggression against internationally recognized state. And we as the Czech Republic or Czechs, we are not on the front line. But our approach to is that while we support Ukraine, because we believe pragmatically supporting Ukraine is also enhancing our security and buying of the time for us. Lithuania is on the front line, Ukraine is at war with Russia, defending or repelling the Russians back to east. If we allow Russia to win the war with so-called frozen conflict or something like that, so they will rearm in 5 years, and then who is the next target? Is the Baltic states, is the Slovakia, it's the Poland, and Poland is heavily, massively transforming its army, just like us. So it's a pragmatic approach, but it's also taking into account that in the long term, we need to, you can't accept this Russian narrative that Ukraine has no choice to choose the side or to be independent or to promote its own values, its own foreign policy. No, it's for people of Ukraine to decide in free election with whom they want to stand. And if in 2014 majority of people decided to support or to pursue the path towards the Western hemisphere or to Western structure, EU and later NATO. And I think that even the last concession when it was offered before the war broke out or the aggression was that President Zelensky mentioned we will not join the NATO. But now it's out of the questions. Because the Ukraine has the moral right one day to become NATO if they feel this is the only umbrella for their sovereignty. So that's a few of the thoughts which I wanted to share with you. And once again, thank you. I think it's a passionate debate. I might have spoken about Syria for a long time.
We'll do that during the break.
I was 4 years in Syria. So there is that dictator is not ours. It was not installed by the West, Bashar al-Assad.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for a really wonderful panel, lots of different perspectives, and it was such an interesting discussion following the first panel, which was absolutely superb, I think. I hope we'll continue to build bridges, to continue to tease out these issues, and I encourage all of you, when you're having a coffee or eating something now, like identify someone who you disagree with. Don't go to someone so that we can exchange views. Again, I'd really like to thank Chris especially also for being part of the driving force of making this happen, and also Vaida, who's there. Just put your hand up, from Lithuanian embassy. She's been working extremely hard behind the scenes to make sure everyone gets here. The Lithuanian embassy, the Czech embassy, everyone. Thank you so much for this great partnership.